Hello, everyone. Welcome to Education Watch Oklahoma. We are coming to you live from the News 9 newsroom where it is Christmas. And just to introduce the show a little bit, we're talking about ESSER funding, which is the federal funding that was released to the state to resolve issues of unfinished learning, staffing issues within schools, just lots of issues that were raised during the pandemic. We're going to have a series of shows on this. The first is called Filling in the Gaps. The show is called Filling in the Gaps. The first in this series is about how state and district leaders can create spending solutions to address a lot of the unfinished learning pandemic-related barriers that we're seeing to K-12 education. So I have a couple of officials from the Oklahoma State Department of Education that are helping districts develop plans to spend their federal money. What are the best ways to do this and who can it benefit? So first on, we're going to have Dr. Kathy Dodd. She is OSDE's Chief Innovation Officer and Deputy Superintendent of Federal Programs. Dr. Dodd, thank you so much for being here with us to discuss a very important topic and hopefully kind of help everyone be able to access what's some pretty complicated funding and some pretty complicated issues. So first, Dr. Dodd, just talk to me about, what's your role at the State Department of Ed and in developing plans for this spending.
Well, thank you so much, Augusta, for having us. Our role really is in alignment with all the roles at the Department of Education, which is to provide technical assistance and support to our almost 540 school districts across the state. And in the case of federal programs, as you said, there are some complicated components of the funding that's coming from the federal government, but really it's a really simple intent, and that is to provide unprecedented support and resources to schools because they have faced unprecedented challenges that have been as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so our role at the department is to partner with school districts to ensure that that funding is being spent in a way that maximizes the impact on students, both on student achievement and well-being, and provides our teachers and our administrators with the necessary supports that they need to help serve students to the best of our ability.
Okay. And so I think first we should start with just explaining for anyone who doesn't understand, what are the rounds of federal funding that came to schools? And let's start there and then kind of go into what phase of funding districts are working with right now.
Yeah, and we have a graphic maybe that you could add to the screen that shows a spending timeline that will help represent the three phases of funding that have come to states. And Oklahoma in particular has received the first wave of funding called the CARES Act, or ESSER 1, known by both of those names. About $160 million came right at the beginning of the pandemic. And the focus of that funding was to respond to the immediate needs that schools were facing as far as keeping schools clean, keeping them open, attempting to do that. And we know that funding was expended pretty quickly, and it was followed by a second round of funding that's called the ESSER 2, or the CRISA Act, and it was passed in December of 2020. And that amounted to $665 million. And that money was also designed to help close the digital divide that students were facing. This is at the time when schools were shut down and many students were learning remotely, if not for all of their education, but for part of it. And so we saw the need to address the device gap and the access issues. So devices and mobile hotspots were part of both ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funding. And then the latest round of funding, ESSER 3, or the American Rescue Plan, was passed in March of 2021. And it amounted to $1.49 billion to the state of Oklahoma. So in total, about $2.3 billion have come to Oklahoma schools to address the needs of this global pandemic.
So I feel like this round of funding is like the fun round of funding. It's like where we get to come up with some really interesting programs, or perhaps new equipment for science classrooms, or we get to take a deeper look at classrooms and what students might need, and then figure out some great ways to meet unfinished learning. I mean, talk about the opportunity that districts have right now, and what this money symbolizes. I think for some, it's a chunk of change they're not going to see again. Hopefully not in terms of a pandemic, but this is a lot of money, and it's unprecedented.
Right. And I mean, the challenge with this type of funding is that the funding will go away. And so schools are thinking very strategically about making this investment last beyond the scope of the funding timeline, but to make sure that they are investing in strategies, in equipment, and in programs that will endure long beyond the funding's lifetime. So I think that's been a challenge for schools. It's also been a tremendous opportunity. In some of the cases, some of the programming that schools have wished that they could add also comes with needing more certified teachers. And as you know, in Oklahoma, we have definitely a funding and a shortage of teachers, a workforce shortage. And so we definitely have looked at ways, even within using our own state dollars, to try to increase the number of teachers that we have within the state that can help fill these very important gaps. And then we worked very intentionally with schools to maximize their own strategic plans that they already may have had in place even before COVID happened, to use these dollars to execute on those plans so that their visions are able to come to fruition, maybe on a shorter timeline, especially in a one-to-one device initiative. I know that for many schools, we were used to sharing laptop carts. We had maybe a few classroom sets of laptops for classroom use, and we would have to figure out a schedule for sharing those. And now, because of these funds, and because of being able to capitalize on the innovations that have come through distance learning, we see more students having a one-to-one opportunity to have their own device, to be able to take that device home, to be able to also, schools are providing a mobile hotspot for those students who may need internet connectivity to be able to access their curriculum and do those projects at home and keep that learning happening even outside of the school hours. So the timeline at which schools have been able to innovate, and the timeline in which they've been able to recognize and realize goals that they had or aspirations they had for their students even before the pandemic happened, has really been accelerated as a result of having these funds. But one of the more important things is that eye toward the future, for thinking about using the funds to meet immediate needs, to try to address learning loss that students are suffering from when school was closed or just in a different format. It was definitely not a normal last couple of years. And so districts have been able to use these funds to address learning loss by creating really exciting summer learning programs, after school, before school learning programs that are both enrichment and academic remediation in one. And I think we've seen a spark of innovation around that extension of the school day and the school year, in the spirit of closing the learning gap that might have been created as a result of COVID.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dodd. And we have another guest from OSDE, Michelle Dunn, Executive Director of Professional Learning and School Support. And I'm going to ask Michelle a little bit about working on the districts. So 90% of this $1.5 billion in this third round of ESSER spending is going directly to school districts. And so you're working with districts to give them the tools to create plans that are well administered and mindful of the requirements of this money coming from the U.S. Department of Education. So talk to me a little bit about, Michelle, just tell us your role in this work and a little bit more about what you do at OSDE.
course. So my primary role is to, like Kathy said, in all of our roles is to support schools. But I work with a large team in the federal programs office, and we work one-on-one with school districts to kind of go through the training and guidance so that they know what the expectation is and what the requirement is. We help them with the technical assistance to put together their plans and submit those. And our office reviews those plans to make sure that they meet the federal guidelines. And then we also work with districts in the reimbursement process to receive the funds.
Okay, so you're kind of preparing districts to plan to spend the money well and then have it spent, be reimbursed appropriately. So
Yes.
talk a little bit about what some of those requirements are and what districts are having to kind of work through in terms of like barriers to how the funding is spent. I believe there's a 20%, there's a requirement that 20% of a school's funding has to be used for unfinished learning. What are some of the other kind of buffers on how this money is being directed?
Well, definitely with the American Rescue Plan, there was more requirements and guidance. And so we've tried to work with districts through that process to take down some of those barriers. And so there are three primary requirements for the American Rescue Plan for schools. The first was a return to learn plan. And so in May, our districts had to figure out how they were going to get students back into school. And luckily in Oklahoma, most of our school districts were open and had already developed those plans and were educating students in buildings. And so that part was very easy for our districts because we were already doing that in Oklahoma, which is a difference from our state than other states. So we could meet that requirement very quickly. So that was the return to learn plan. The second part of the American Rescue Plan requirements was the consultation. And so there is a very extensive consultation requirement in the American Rescue Plan. And it requires that district leadership involve all sorts of stakeholders in their plan to spend these funds. So that might include students and parents, teachers, teachers unions, tribes, health professionals with guidelines, special education populations, administrators. And so that consultation piece, getting all of those people to come to the table and be a part of the conversation is very important for the uses of funds for the American Rescue Plan. So that was the second piece. And we tried to help districts identify who they need to be on their team, and then work with them to how you use that team to better leverage the funding. And then the last piece is the uses of funds plan, which is basically exactly like it sounds. They have to put a plan together for exactly how they're going to spend these funds over the 3-year period to maximize that impact for students. And the uses of funds plan has its own requirements, own pieces of the puzzle that have to fit in, and we have worked with districts to make that as streamlined and easy as possible to get their uses of funds plan formulated and submitted so that they can start spending these dollars.
Okay, so what this looks like on the ground is schools trying to develop plans to spend this money in a way that addresses the needs of their district, their teachers, their classrooms, their students. Reporting on pandemic impact on schools has brought a lot of stories, from teachers who are trying to reach like that one student who has a very specific, barrier, but the pandemic just made it all impossible, or students with disabilities who have their own set of access issues that the pandemic exacerbated, or, students who experience food insecurity and, couldn't, were lacking meals at different points and were, double stressed because of their own home stressors. I mean, the story of how schools are going to identify those unique problems and then develop plans to solve them, to address them, is, I think, a story that some of these students might tell in 20 years. You know what I mean? Like how their school stepped in and addressed their issue at this very critical moment in their education. What do you hear from districts as they're trying to identify some very, I mean, I think there's broad issues that we understand in terms of like we need hotspots, and we need kids to be able to access their education remotely when it's not safe to be in the classroom. That was a very widespread issue everybody had to figure out. But then classroom to classroom, students experience this pandemic so differently, and I can only imagine that districts are kind of trying to identify those issues and address them in specific ways. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, just a little more specifically, about what some of these plans seek to solve?
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure first. So some of the requirements for the American Rescue Plan and the uses of funds are trying to help districts with that process. I think that is why the consultation was so important as a piece of the American Rescue Plan, is at least it brings all of those people to the table so you can try to identify those issues. And so we've really tried to help districts make that connection with their communities so that they can identify those needs. And then there's also a portion in the American Rescue Plan that specifically lists groups that were disproportionately impacted by COVID, and to meet their social emotional needs, their academic needs. There's just different pieces that in the guidance to develop these uses of funds plans, it kind of tries to point districts in the right direction. And some of those things that districts are trying to do are some of the things Kathy talked about earlier. So districts are meeting with their consultation teams, their parents, their students, and it is very one-on-one in identifying those specific needs. And luckily the funding is so flexible that when you identify the need, it is most likely an allowable expenditure if it meets one of those needs that is because of COVID. So we have seen a lot of schools bump up their counselors, and that's also part of one of our statewide initiatives to increase the number of counselors, because we know the social emotional well-being of our students has taken a huge hit. And that piece, I believe, is what is leading to identifying the additional needs that students have. So it was a huge push that kind of led to discovering more needs that our students have. The nation has also been doing the free school lunch for everyone. And so I think that you spoke about that need that students who were not being fed at school had that additional weight, that additional challenge. And so school districts have tried to, when they were out of school, do pickup meals or drop-off meals or park buses in neighborhoods or at apartments. And so they're trying to meet the needs, because if we know anything about our schools, we know that they know our students, and they are the first line of defense for most of those needs. And so that's just a couple of things. The counselors and the, getting food were just a couple of the things that I know that districts have done.
Okay, Michelle, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And along the vein of kind of community involvement, I think Dr. Dodd would be a great person to transition to talk to about what the community can do right now in partnership with schools. What can some of, as districts seek to consult with community, some community members, there's some foundations in the community. Oklahoma City Public Schools has a great foundation that's doing some really great work on their staffing and, a million other things. And I think it's an interesting moment. And I understand that you have a focus and an expertise in community schools. Maybe talk a little bit about what this could look like. I guess what types of kind of creative community solutions could come from this consultation requirement for this funding? What do you hope to see?
Well, I think that the pandemic definitely illuminated the many ways that schools provide supports for students and families. And the funding that's coming now through the American Rescue Plan, the ESSER programs, are, for the first time ever, really prioritizing the type of foundational support that schools have always wished that they could provide, the additional counselors, the family support liaisons. That would be something that is an eligible function of these funds. And additionally, the before and after school programming and summer programming. So from an academic perspective, a research base, that's called a full service community school. And that's when we leverage the investment and the relationships that have already been made in our local schools by already having those trusted relationships with teachers and students and families. And we already have buildings that are available to be open, extended hours. And then we're able to partner in very intentional ways with people in the community, whether that's after school programs or whether that's medical or mental health support, or even churches or local chambers of commerce, foundations, and invite those stakeholders into the space so that we can co-locate some of the experiences that in the past have been offered off-site. So if your student, if you had to figure out how to get your child to Boy Scouts that met at the American Legion, and you didn't have the ability to take off work to do that, your child might not have been in Boy Scouts or dance class, or maybe even after school tutoring if the bus didn't run to take kids home from that extra time after school. So there were a lot of kids that were missing out on those experiences. And so by adopting this community schools philosophy, rather than students having to figure out transportation and even community partners having to pay for that space, then we make our schools available to those outside entities as community-based partners, and we bring the programming to the students, which makes it so much logistically, makes so much more sense and capitalizes on the time. So you don't have students on buses trying to get them transported or parents trying to figure out the carpool. It's just bringing those resources into the school. And we've seen so many creative ideas that have come out of the pandemic. I mean, it's been humbling to see teachers and administrators and counselors and the links that cafeteria staff have gone to make sure that the whole student, the whole family was being served at this very emotional and tumultuous time. And so to be able to now take money and bring that to the table and allow that funding to be used to provide these extra supports where it doesn't just all fall on the teacher, it doesn't all fall on the principal, but this is a shared responsibility in the community to provide these most important resources and extra opportunities for learning and extra opportunities for relationship building, all of the things that we know make a well-rounded student. So whether it's food insecurities, whether it's additional nurses, which we've seen our COVID funding go to adding more counselors, as Michelle mentioned, but also so many more school nurses and family liaisons, community school coordinators to help coordinate those extra supports for students and take that responsibility off the plate of the teacher and principal and school counselor, who and the front office team that runs our schools. They juggle so many tasks, they can't take one more thing. But for us to be able to have a more intentional, shared leadership model that welcomes those community resources to the table and makes them part of the school-wide initiative is really not only a smart use of our COVID dollars right now in response to a pandemic, but it's just a smart strategy for us to think about that would endure in the future. So I'm excited that in addition to the COVID funds, the ESSER 1, 2, and 3 funding that's come from the government, federal government, you've also seen a big increase in the number of grants that are available under that community schools umbrella, because the research really does bear out that this is a smart strategy for schools, an efficient and effective use of funds.
Okay. So let's talk timeline. I mean, at what point can, parents and students, obviously they've already seen big changes in their schools as a result of this, of ESSER funding in the past, but for this third round, which is the most money, which is, for Oklahoma City Public Schools, I believe it's like $165 million for, variety, it's tens of millions for many schools. When will communities see that in their district, families see that in their district? Obviously in the next 3 years, but in the next 6 months, what do you expect community members to see?
Well, the funding did come in waves, and they had a little bit of a different focus, as we talked about. First, a little bit more logistical in response to the pandemic. Some of the things that we talked about that aren't as exciting, like being able to improve air quality within schools, being able to, add heating and air and even windows for much needed for our schools that were losing a lot of energy in old buildings, roof replacements, things, leaky roofs. It was a structural investment in the beginning and a response to COVID, a lot of cleaning materials, cleaning supplies and masks and things like that. Now we've seen this third wave just begin to arrive as schools have worked through spending their CARES Act funds or ESSER 1, their CRISA Act funds or ESSER 2, and now their ARP Act funds or ESSER 3 funds their plans have been approved, and we're starting to begin to see claims come through to address some of those initiatives that we spoke of. Oklahoma City, I'm so glad you brought them up because they have a fantastic plan with some really innovative ideas that they're bringing to bear. Of course, they've invested a lot in device connectivity and one-to-one initiative, ensuring that families have the ability to have a mobile hotspot and to have a device for each student. But they're also adding 4 mobile health clinics that are helping to provide additional support to nurses at schools. And they're even doing a telemedicine pilot with their ARP funds, looking into seeing how they can provide, again, more support for nurses, but tremendous support for students and families right there co-located within the school building. So we're seeing a lot of innovation coming out, and the planning has had to happen very fast. That's why I mentioned that districts haven't just started innovating and planning strategically as a result of these funds. Those plans have been in place long before the pandemic, but these funds are helping to bring those strategies to bear for addressing prolonged problems or issues like building issues, but then new problems that crept up as a result of the pandemic, like addressing learning loss. So we've just seen really creative responses from districts, and families are already beginning to see some of the fruits of that investment, but definitely will in the months to come.
Okay. And kind of along that line, I think there was some very specific language in the requirements for how this money should be spent and the intention of it that asked that students who experience a variety of different types of disadvantages be targeted with this funding. Yeah. And that touches on longstanding issues, food insecurity, lack of mental health resources, a variety of longstanding issues with some populations of students accessing a great education in the same way that a more stable student experiences. Talk a little bit about, like you were saying, we have some longstanding social issues that impact education in elementary, secondary students. Pandemic exacerbated some of those. And who are these students? Maybe just talk about who the overarching intention of this funding to target students who are transient or, just kind of describe some of the issues that those students face.
Well, we're really intentional about saying that, all students have so much potential, but definitely, as you alluded to, different amounts of support coming from home or family make a big difference in how they're able to access their education. So as a part of the ESSER funds, the plan requires you to address those student populations that are disproportionately affected by COVID. And so those are students that have been on free and reduced lunch, those students who are an IEP, they're on a student with special needs, students of color, English language learners, students who are served in foster care, students who may have experienced homelessness or may have even been incarcerated. And so the plan requires districts to ensure that there are extra layers of support over and above what's provided to all students. So students that don't speak English as their first language. So one example would be like the one-to-one device and connectivity might be provided for all students, but there may be additional software that is designed to help close that language gap for students who don't speak English as their first language. Or to look at it more positively, those students who are on the cusp of being bilingual, thinking of it from the assets that they bring and helping to recognize the assets that all of our families and students have, and then thinking about using these funds in intentional ways to shore up some of the areas where they need extra support. And so that's why we try not to say that they're at risk, but they're at promise. And when they have the requisite amount of support that they need, then we know that their chances of reaching their full potential increase exponentially. And so, like you said, to start off this conversation, this is an unprecedented opportunity to really provide that level of intentional support for all students, but also being very mindful for our students who may need that extra layer of care.
Okay. And what's when I was reporting a story at the State Department of Ed when the data matrices were first released, and there was a lot of kind of like prep with the media to make sure we understood them before we reported, about that data, what it would look like, what it means, what it does and doesn't say at face value. I thought it was really interesting that the data reporting that kind of supplements districts' understanding of their students came down to very specific variables in, like classroom to classroom, what some students got and what some students didn't. And, in this classroom, who could come to the evening extra class, or who could really access in all the different ways that education was curriculums were trying to be distributed and accessibly. And of course it was very difficult. And I just thought it was so interesting how specific every student's situation kind of became. And that translates to how challenging it must be for districts to find their students, to see their students, and to understand what some of the solutions they require might be to provide equity as they seek to bring everybody up to the level that they can access their education fairly. I guess, what does that process take within, I'm just kind of curious how those answers are being sought and what districts are doing. There's the consultation, but just talk a little bit about the process to finding those best practice solutions for students.
Sure. Well, I think that schools have been on this road, of course, from the very beginning, as far as trying to understand the individual needs of students, looking at that quantitative data that comes from that one point in time. That's just one piece of data that we get from students from those state assessments. But there are also the data markers that schools have and classroom teachers have every day from just the informal assessments that happen that let us know how individualized learning must happen in a classroom to help not only fill a learning need, but also to stretch students who need more enrichment. And so that process happens dynamically in a classroom. But I think some of the stories that have come from COVID, where the families are being very transparent about some of the needs that have resulted from being at home, or it could be a loss of job, it could be a change in family structure, just the additional stress. It could be that they've lost a loved one. I know that sometimes we think about these layers of support that we offer through a community schools philosophy as for students in need. But I know when my daughter was in elementary school, her grandmother passed away, and my mother passed away, and my daughter was able to go to a grief group within her school. And there's an example of how school has stepped in and offered additional mental health support, if you want to call it that, additional social emotional support for a student that I could have taken on my own to see a therapist, but it was normalized that grief that she felt she was able to work through part of that process by being part of a grief group after school that I signed her up for. And she did work through some of that with her classmates. And that was incredibly powerful. So when I think about all of the ways that students have needs, it's not it's not students of a particular background that fits neatly in that category. As you said, it's so dynamic as to what makes a student succeed in a particular academic area or succeed and able to take advantage of extracurricular activities. And the goal of school, even beyond this funding, is to help remove those barriers and make it as accessible, remove the gatekeepers, remove the barriers so that all students can take advantage of the great opportunities that are being offered across our schools, across our entire state. So I'm excited to see the creativity that teachers and administrators, school leaders, school boards have made in thinking about how they can use this one-time, unprecedented amount of funding to make a big difference in the lives of students now and for the future.
Okay. And Dr. Dodd or Michelle, is there anything else along the lines of this topic that you think is, something particularly a point we need to make sure that we're sharing, an insight that you have that I haven't asked about, that kind of helps, I think, for the community to just understand a little bit better, what this funding could do, what it's intended for, and what they should be looking for in their local district or the district they pay taxes in.
Yes, absolutely. I think that a huge piece as community members is be prepared to receive the invitation from your local school district and to be a part of that team, be a part of the solution, be a part of identifying the needs of the students, and be willing to help in any way you can. Schools could not function without their community support. And so if there's anything that we could ask community members to do, it would be for them to offer a helping hand, to not turn that down, and to really have an open ear and an open heart towards what's best for our students and maximizing the impact in this opportunity that we have with this funding.
Okay, that's great. I was just doing a story with Millwood Public School. It's about some tutoring programs that they're doing. And it's so funny you say that because their message was, if your teacher recommends a little extra tutoring for your student, like, make it happen. Like, parents, you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
Everybody get involved, get that kid more hours,
Yes, and if there's something that a need that a family has, don't be scared to share that with the teacher or the principal or the superintendent, whoever that's involved in the school. The school is such a great resource, and they are doing amazing work, and so they can help. The school can help.
Okay, great. Well, with that, Michelle, Dr. Dodd, you've both been so wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on our first episode of Education Watch Oklahoma. And just as a reminder, this show we'll kind of, I hope you both come back. We'll have a few more episodes along this topic. Some of the topics we'll look at over the next 6-8 weeks are a little more in-depth questions about how this funding could support staffing initiatives, how this funding could help kind of provide equity for certain populations of students. There's just how community members can be a part of helping solve some unfinished learning questions, provide supports to schools. I think we've opened kind of a fascinating line of conversation with Dr. Dodd's kind of philosophy of community schools and what that means for foundations, businesses, families, community members in the area who could support education for our elementary, secondary students. So I think an exciting time for education in Oklahoma as schools seek to spend well this $1.5 billion opportunity that's coming in the form of this pandemic-related relief money. So we'll have lots more on this topic. Thank you to the community, to everyone who joined in tonight. Feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm Augusta McDonnell at News 9, and you can find me on social. And I would love to hear from you about what questions you have for for schools, for administrators about, this kind of current promise of funding and what you might expect to see. And thanks again for coming into our newsroom for an hour on your Tuesday evening. We have our Christmas decorations and our scanners, so thank you for being patient with all the background noise as well. Again, I'm Augusta McDonnell. This is Education Watch Oklahoma. Everybody have a great evening.